Today we're talking about wealth, who's earning it and how it's earned, and where to find it. Historically, the most common way to earn wealth was to inherit it. Our parents said, accumulate wealth by staying at a corporate job for over a decade. But we know that's not how to do it anymore. What if I told you there's a different way? There are 22 million millionaires in the US, and a growing percentage are under the age of 45. Today, I'm sitting down with Ethan Agarwal, CEO of Initialized company, the Coterie. And we're gonna talk exactly about wealth. Let's get started. Ethan, thank you so much for coming on the channel today. Today we're talking about something that I think is near and dear to your heart and my heart and a lot of people who are watching right now, which is how do you get rich, but also once you get rich, how do you keep it?
Yeah, I think we probably want to start with defining that word, right? So I think the word rich or even wealthy has changed a lot in just 10 years. If you look back a couple generations ago, rich or wealthy was sort of a goal, and it was like, okay, once I'm wealthy, then I'm done. Then I'm gonna retire on the beach, right? Now, we think of wealth as like an unlock to go do whatever we actually wanna do, right? So like, you're in a job that maybe you like or don't like, but ultimately the goal is to get enough money because you wanna go start a company or you want to invest in an idea or you wanna start a nonprofit or whatever. So wealth is no longer seen as an end game. It's seen as like the unlock to freedom to go do what you want. So how do you get that? Well, historically, the most likely way to get rich was to have rich parents. That's still true, by the way. In the US, about a third of the wealth in the country is inherited wealth. The other third is sort of in stock trading and investing and things like that. But the other third of it is created. And I think the question is, what inspires people to create a meaningful amount of wealth? And one of the things that we have found is that there's something about the DNA of second generation immigrants. And America is an immigrant country by definition, but there's something about second generation immigrants that inspires them to create immense amount of wealth, ironically, without actually trying to do it.
We get the job done.
Immigrants get the job done, right? And like, it's a byproduct, right? It's like, we have something else we want to do, and you end up creating, wealth out of that. And so then the question becomes, what are the attributes about second generation founders or second generation immigrants that makes them so successful?
I mean, Balaji Srinivasan always talks about this. There's a huge difference between sort of inherited wealth and built wealth.
Right.
And, it's something that, I don't know, is sort of in your history and my history, actually.
Yeah, I mean, why don't you start? Like, I think your story is so fascinating of where you started and, what you've built in the last 15 years by yourself.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
I mean, I think what's weird though, when you look at some of the immigrant communities, is that if you go back a few generations, like sometimes, especially in the Chinese diaspora, you actually notice that people had to leave China because of the communist revolution,
right.
Literally. So, my grandparents on both sides actually had to flee because they gave the businesses in their home countries to great aunts and uncles who then were killed or persecuted. We're sort of the survivor generation because we fled. And then the weirdest thing for me, realizing at some point that my grandfather actually had his factory seized in China by the left, and then he rebuilt his businesses from scratch in Myanmar, and then the anti-Chinese government actually seized it again. But 8 brothers and sisters ended up like out here in Canada and the United States. And there's like an incredible amount of immigration that has like that kind of story, that like the 20th century took incredible amounts of basically survivor genetics and planted it here.
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument about the people that came here were I don't know how to say this, but sort of the most eager, the greatest fighters, the most sort of exploratory, wanted to get out. And like, so in America, they passed the Asian Immigration Act, which is why a lot of your ancestors, my ancestors, came here in the 60s and 70s. And in our case, my dad is one of 4, and he came here to study because education was critical to him and his family. and he started as a professor. And like just being able to study whatever he wanted at some of the best schools was like, that was reason enough to leave his country and his family at 19 and come out here, right? And so he like became a professor and then eventually started a company. And, you know, I learned a lot about running a company obviously from him, but it's exactly what you said. It's like you see an opportunity somewhere else, you go there with nothing, and you build something from that. Starting a company is a little bit of a microcosm of that, right? Like there's nothing there and you create something from it. That's what the immigrant story is. There was nothing there, they came here with nothing, and then they created something from it. And so I think we see that in our parents and our grandparents, and we say, okay, they started on, you know, in the dugout and they got to second or third base, and now what can we do? We started on second or third base, and can we hit a home run? And then what do we do with our kids? You know, like that's the dialogue that runs through our head, or at least for me, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was definitely a big dimension for me. I mean, the only other thing that was crazy for me was that my father actually really struggled with alcoholism.
Okay.
So we actually grew up like sort of working class. I mean, my mom didn't have language ability,
okay.
and as a result, she could never pass the tests to be beyond like a nurse assistant.
Okay.
So my whole childhood, she had to work like 2 jobs, more or less like at nurse assistant wage, which is close to minimum wage.
Wow.
And so, you know, that's like a whole other dimension for me.
So what does that do for you, like on a daily, like how do you process that? How do you like, you must leverage that somehow in your mind to do what you've been able to do since then.
I think the trickiest thing is realizing how rare that story actually is. And then I spent most of my time acting like it wasn't a part of me.
Oh, interesting.
And then now I realize, no, that's actually, when I make decisions like big or small, that's sort of in the background, right? And it actually, you know, since we're on the topic of, you know, how do you live your life, I realized, you know, for instance, I didn't, you know, get married and, you know, have children until much later in my life, specifically because of that. Like, I never wanted to be in that situation that seeing my parents fight over money, like constantly, because there just wasn't enough. And sometimes it was like, you know, a 6-pack of beer versus like dinner for the family, right? And so I never ever wanted to be in that situation. So like clawing and getting to a point where like I solved the money problem, to steal a phrase from Paul Graham's essays, is like, that was really important to me.
Yeah, it becomes, this goes back to the point about it being an unlock, right? So my guess is that for you, wealth was never a goal. It's sort of a byproduct that's come out of all the great work that you've done. And so, you know, you're saying like you wanted to make sure that you were financially secure before you started a family. Okay, like that makes a lot of sense. But what keeps you going is not, my guess, the accumulation of wealth. What keeps you going is a curiosity, and you love the work that you do, and then wealth is a byproduct of that. And that's how I thought about it. I remember, so the first time that I saw an amount of money that I didn't know what to do with was my first company, Aptive. It was a digital fitness company. We were growing pretty well, and I took some secondary off the table because, you know, we were growing 5x year over year, and we raised another round, and, you know, everything was going well. So I took some secondary off. And I remember like feeling very awkward because I didn't know who to talk to about it. And I could go to a friend, but then you're sort of bragging, right? Like, oh, look at all this money. How do I, like, what do you think, right? You can go to sort of your parents or your parents' friends, but that's a little weird because they have very different incentives than you do. Or you can go to a wealth advisor, right? And it's like, I go talk to the Goldman guy and the Morgan Stanley guy and all those folks, and they didn't get it at all, right? They're like, you know, older and just used to a different type of client and a different mentality and different risk and everything. And so it felt a little like unnerving, where you're like, I feel like I have a responsibility now. I've been given this gift of some money and want to think about what to do about it effectively, and I don't want to squander it. So where do you turn? And we can get there, but like this was part of my inspiration for starting the Coterie, is like there has to be a resource, a tool for people like me who are, or people like you who are building, who are ambitious, who see money as a way to help them achieve the things that they want to achieve, as opposed to money being the end goal itself. And there's a way of not only building products that are relevant to people like you and me, but also a way of delivering those products and a way of interacting with the customer. And everything else that we interact with in our life is of such high quality, such high caliber, so much software and thought has gone into it. And then there's like finance, and it's like, oh my God, like I have to deal with like this thing and I have to get 3 different wet signatures and I have to do this and that. And it's just like, it's this part of our life that we don't want to spend time on. And so I said, if we built a company that unlocks these super creative, super powerful, super ambitious people, and I make their lives a little bit easier by taking the financial management off of their plate, we could unlock Garry Tan to be Garry Tan 2.0. Like, if the Coterie was around 15 years ago, it presumably would have been very helpful to you, in the last 15 years and to the people that are watching the show. And so that's where I felt like there was a need to build something for people like us. And look, so far so good, but it's early.
So earlier we were saying that about 1/3 of the wealth is actually built wealth, not inherited or, somehow through financial engineering. You got there, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny, like my experience with wealth management is somewhat similar in that I talked to some people who claimed that they could pick equities better than the hedge funds, and that was like sort of a startup. And then way over on the other end is sort of talking to a bulge bracket wealth manager who, really is built for that, 2/3. Like they don't really even speak the language of what's preferred stock, what's common stock, like how do I even get liquidity for you, right?
Yeah.
And then I was able to find, someone sort of in the middle.
Yeah.
And then even then they had to believe that I could turn into ultra high net worth. And that was like sort of a chance for them, right? And
okay, so this is amazing because this is where software comes in.
Yeah.
So the issue that you encountered is the same issue that everyone encounters when they first deal with a wealth manager, and it's not their fault. The problem is that a wealth manager or an advisor is a human being that does not scale. And so they can't afford to be wrong because there's massive marginal costs associated with servicing you. So if they service you before you're at a level where you're profitable and then it turns out that you're not profitable, they just wasted a bunch of time. But that's not fair because it's not your job to do that, right? Like you need advice, you need guidance, you need access at any level. It shouldn't matter that you need to reach a certain level for them to care about you. So what we realized is software, just like every other industry, can be a massive unlock in finance. So what we do is we service folks at a much earlier stage. So you can have accredited investor is our starting point, which is $200,000 of annual income over the last 2 years. And that's still like pretty high relative to America, but it's far lower than where most wealth advisors will start spending time with someone. And so our philosophy is we want to build decades-long relationships with our members. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to provide products that are relevant to them at different stages in their life. So a lot of the people that we have to start with are 25 years old, working in finance or working at a startup, and they have a salary and they have some RSUs and they get to 200K. So they fit the bill for us. And there's a set of products that are relevant for them at that stage. Maybe they want to invest a little bit. Maybe they want to borrow a little bit of money. Maybe they're thinking about diversifying a little bit. Then as you get older, you get married or maybe you start a company and then maybe you have kids and you need to do your estate planning. And then you have a big liquidity event and you need to do something specific with that capital. But we can do all those things because our marginal cost of servicing someone is basically zero because everything is distributed through software. So the worst case scenario for our business is that someone is slightly less profitable than someone else. And because of that, we can attract really, really high quality people very early on in their careers. And we don't need to hope that they become super successful and then become profitable down the road. Because what ends up happening is you don't want to treat someone as a transaction, right? The goal is not like, hey, I'm doing you a favor by servicing you before you are at the band that I usually care about. Like that's a horrible way to start a relationship. You want to provide them with value additive services at that point without the expectation of a future payoff. Otherwise, you're just in sort of a sales kind of role, and that's not fair for the client when you think about managing the wealth that they've accumulated. So we haven't seen anyone bring software to this industry, and we feel pretty confident that by bringing software to it, we can make it a high margin business, which is not just good for the company, it's good for the customer as well.
That makes sense. What are some of the things that, should be top of mind for someone who's sort of like, either a Henry or about to become, high net worth?
Yeah, so I think the key question you have to answer for yourself is, what do you want to do with your money, right? So some people are in the wealth accumulation space, and I understand that. Like maybe they grew up money insecure, and they say, I want to amass and save as much of it as possible. Like, that's totally respectable. Some people say, I want a super high risk strategy. I'm super confident in my future earnings, so today I want to invest as much as I can in all kinds of stuff. Other people say, like, hey, all I want to do is buy a house. That's like my primary focus. So you have to answer that question for yourself about what do you want. But there's some basic things that I think are smart for almost anyone to do. One is diversification. So a lot of your folks, listeners, I assume, are going to be like startup people or investors, and we tend to have a lot of our wealth consolidated in one highly liquid asset. That's not great financial management that I think anyone will tell you. And so thinking about diversification into other investments, other companies, other asset classes is really important. So that's one of the things the Coterie does, is we offer you the ability to invest in funds that are more diversified than any specific company equity. Two is estate planning. So a lot of people think that estate planning is something that should be done much later in life when you're older and wealthier. But the best time to do your estate planning is actually before any of your assets have appreciated in value. So it doesn't matter if you're married or if you have kids. If you have a job where you have either equity in the company or carry in a fund or any kind of ownership, you should do some estate planning. Very, very basic stuff, just like a revocable trust, and put some of your equity or carry in there. It costs a couple $1,000 to create it, but it's really worth it. If you ever get sued, if you ever want to see like tax savings down the road, if you get married and then get divorced, there's like a whole bunch of protections associated with it. The line that I have heard from really smart lawyers that I think is true is everybody has an estate plan, whether you know it or not. If you don't have one that you've created, the state imposes one on you. So you don't want to rely on the state's estate plan. You want to build your own. So estate planning would be a second one. And then a third one is, going back to the point about thinking about what you want, is for some people, borrowing can help enhance their goals, because liquidity and lending is hard to come by for founders, because traditional banks don't give a lot of credit, literally, for private company equity. And so if you're confident in future earnings, if you're looking for leverage, if you have a low cost of capital, borrowing can help you reach your goals faster. So those are some of the basics to think about. But again, it depends on your specific goals.
Yeah, one of the craziest thing about the ultra high net worth thing is that banks will just give you sort of, a few points on top of LIBOR just as margin account. And it's like super cheap lending, but you have to be rich in order to even have access to it, which seems very unfair.
Totally unfair. And like, how do you break into that group if you don't have access to the products that they have access to?
It's an accelerant.
As an accelerant, especially if they got their money from inheritance or something else, right? Like, if you didn't have to build your way up to that, it's a very different conversation. And so when we talk about the wealth gap in this country, bringing access to the products that are available for people with 100 million plus down to people who only have 200,000 plus, hopefully unlocks a set of freedom and tools that helps you get up to that level.
How do you think about like the barbell? Because that's sort of my strategy when I think about, there's sort of stuff that is hyper risk.
Yeah.
And then, this is stuff that either is going to go to zero or maybe a 10 or 20x or 100x or 1000x, whatever it is.
Yeah. So I think it totally depends on how much discretionary income you have, right? So like if your life, so to speak, is covered, your expenses are covered by your monthly income or whatever that is, then you have this set of money to play with. Then it becomes generally a barbell strategy. Works well. Part of the reason,
one part of the barbell is your safe
Treasuries.
money, right? Yeah. Treasuries, like it'll always be there kind of money. And then way over on the other end is like, let me go crazy on like, what kind of crazy return can I get?
And so on the crazy return thing, the key part of that is access to those deals, right? So you have access to them because you've built a foundation for them. A lot of the people listening to the show may not have access to those deals. And so we realized early on that providing access to really high quality investments was a deal breaker for a lot of people because they just couldn't get access to them even if they wanted to pursue that strategy. And so democratizing access to those really high quality investments, can unlock someone's ambition in terms of building that barbell strategy.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you do, for instance, is get people access to venture capital funds that normally people can't get to at all.
I mean, the IRRs, so we provide access to Initialized, for example. We provide access to Andreessen Horowitz. We provide access to a few other funds of that caliber. And one, a retail investor generally would not have access to those funds. And two, if they did, the minimums were, $25 million or whatever it is. And so we'll provide access for as little as $25,000. And if you look at the IRRs of those funds, IRR stands for internal rate of return, which is basically just looking at the return that the fund generates over several years compounded. It dramatically exceeds any place else you can park your capital, right? Like S&P, NASDAQ, certainly treasuries, a 401k, like it doesn't matter if a 25-year-old had put, 100K into Initialized 10 years ago versus put 100K into basically anything else, they would have done a lot better in Initialized. And 10 years ago, they didn't have access to it. So fine, they didn't do it. But today, when someone is starting out, we want to get them access to these funds so that they can realize their potential sooner by getting better returns on their capital.
Yeah, it's sort of a pretty obvious sort of gap in the market if you think about it, because venture capital historically is for sort of like long dated endowments that sort of don't care on duration. That's the classic like David Swenson Yale model of endowment investing. Like endowments don't care. They just want the money to go, they don't need it right away. They can only sort of
live off the interest.
Spend like 5% anyway per year, right?
Yeah.
So, the funniest thing is that means that if you're young, you're actually the best candidate to, actually enjoy the benefits of being in a venture capital firm, because it still takes, 10, 15 years of to get liquidity on, whatever the investment is. And yet, like, you have to be inherited wealth and already have it. Or, if you're built wealth, you might be much older, and like by the time you actually see it, you'll have already retired, and maybe it works out. But it just isn't that good a product comparatively.
The other thing that's interesting is, if you look 30 years ago, a lot of the way that wealth was built, even in that other third, was you stayed in the same job for 20, 30, 40 years, sometimes until you retire. And in sort of the twilight part of that is when you made enough money that you could, build wealth off of that. Our generation doesn't do that. We're changing jobs every 3 to 5 years. We're sort of taking our 401ks with us here and there. We have equity that is actually a larger part of our compensation than our salaries. And so when you have a 25-year-old today who's changing jobs every couple years and whose comp is going up not by 3% a year, but by 10 or 15 or 20% a year because of bonuses, because of job changing, et cetera, when you have a high degree of certainty of your future earnings, allocating your capital in a way that is more long-term thinking, like venture capital, is really, really smart, right? So when we were growing up, a lot of the advice that we got around how to manage our money was based on a different set of expectations about how you earned money. Because 30 years ago, we earned money very differently. For us, we earn money in a very different way. And so we have to adapt our strategies based on the way that we have money coming in the door, as opposed to what it was 30 years ago.
And one of the things that's really different about what you're doing versus like a robo-advisor, for instance, is like this is sort of tailored to like future built wealth in a lot of ways, right? A robo will say, just, low fees, throw it in S&P, that's the best you're going to get.
Yeah, I think if you want that, there's a lot of good products out there already that cover that. Our pitch is a little bit more to the idea of someone who wants to manage their own wealth and their own financial profile. So like one of the things we learned going back to the conversation around second generation immigrants is, as they have built their wealth, a lot of them have decided to maintain control of it. So I read this amazing stat that if you're under the age of 45 and you have over $500,000, there's a 70% chance that you are managing your own wealth. That was not true 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So more and more people are controlling their wealth. And so the Coterie's play is not advisory. The Coterie's play is access, where we say, hey, you probably have $1 to $50 million of total net worth, and maybe you're interested in investing in some companies or in funds like Initialized. Maybe you want to borrow, maybe you want to do your estate plan, but you're not looking to just say like, hey, please take care of this for me. That's a different profile. And more than the wealth level, it's a different personality type. And it's a different ambition and a different sort of where am I going next kind of thinking. So we're looking for the person that still has their hands on the joystick and is like super interested in their own financial profile and learning about new companies and wants to take risks, wants to develop their barbell strategy.
Yeah, it's funny to think about wealth management because there's really two different concepts at play. And then most of the things that exist already are very focused on beta. It's like, don't pay too many fees to people who are dumb, who are not going to get you better than just what the market's going to give you anyway.
Right.
And then there's this other thing that, like, frankly, I think very few people end up having access to or thinking about, which is alpha.
Exactly.
It's like, what are the things that you uniquely can get access to? And, you know, if you can get access to it, like, it's pretty awesome.
It's such a good point. The feedback you always hear is like, you can't outperform the market, so don't even try, so put your money in an index fund. The problem with that argument is that assumes that you don't have access to the people that do outperform the market, like Initialized and all the other funds out there. So if you can get access to those that are alpha creators as opposed to just following the beta, you can have outsized returns. And how do you get access to them? Historically, you have to be really wealthy or really well connected. That's where companies like the Coterie come around and unlock that access much earlier.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting about, like, future built wealth is that often they are product managers or designers or engineers themselves.
Yeah.
And I always think about, you know, Peter Lynch's classic about, you know, invest in the brands that you uniquely know and understand, because that's how you beat the street.
Well, you build the products that you want to see in the world, right? So like a product is when you build a product, you have a perspective on the world. So every product that you build is a perspective. And if you engage with the world in a way where you're identifying, like, how come this thing doesn't exist? How come that thing doesn't exist? Then you're naturally just going to be building products that solve those problems. And the more that you see by getting access to funds or companies or ideas earlier, the more, like, inputs that you have to allow you to make those decisions. And that's the coolest thing about this is, like, if you can unlock someone's sort of creative flexibility by giving them enough money or by helping them reach their goals, then they're going to go build these things because they have the ability to do those. Otherwise, they have to work in a job because they have to just live by their salary.
So Ethan, what would someone do to sort of get involved and, you know, try what you're working on?
Yeah, so the best thing is just to go to our website, thecoterie.co, and sign up for our waitlist. We're adding new people every day. We have, you know, the products I mentioned, investing, lending, estate planning, and others coming. But our website's the best place to find out more.
That's awesome. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Garry.